Oh, the schoolboy always, which for me was always, it helped me. I could hop on stage and it gives me a bit of confidence.
Angus Young's height isn't much greater. He provides only his own instrument. Tearful backstage remarks haven't changed much in more than 50 years and never attempt to become a representation. To make matters worse, the Gibson SG is still wearing the schoolboy uniform and is thrashing while performing the classic duck walk while skipping across the stage like a child's class. However, behind the image of that perpetual schoolboy is someone who has never truly been okay, and Angus Young is afraid of the stage. Every time he walks in, his hands shake. He watched his sister in the spotlight. Angus lost his memory and died, but he kept playing despite the death of a close friend. Despite being falsely linked to horrific murder cases, Angus is a wild guitar player, despite the fact that the world sees him all the time. Emerged as the most robust cornerstone in silence of AC/DC, who never even left when everyone else did. This song doesn't glorify the well-known songs Back in Highway to Hell or Black, which tell the story of everyday songs that come as a surprise and even the strange moments that make up the real Angus Young. In 1980, when Young's brother was just 25 years old, AC/DC hurried into the studio to compose and record Back in Black Angus. Young was quiet, obstinate, and deeply sentimental. Malcolm was 27, bassist was 26, and Phil Rudd was 26. Cliff Williams and Brian Johnson were both 30 years old. Bon Scott's replacement was the oldest when he passed away. 32. You're still fumbling around in bar bands when most of the musicians were Angus. The band didn't have time to grieve. They had two options: either disband or get up and create something resilient enough to withstand the disaster. Later, as a real storm was brewing, hurricane season was in full swing in the Bahamas, where they had decided to record Wind Howling at Compass Point Studios. Young was carrying the weight of a collapsing mammoth. Bon Scott, the band's brother's companion, and the only voice of AC/DC, had recently died during a night of intoxicated driving. The studio windows trembled. We essentially had nothing, even with the ceiling leak and the riffs still flowing out. Angus recalled that the complete record was present on the first day and then a few days later. Back in Black was completed in 7 weeks, and when it was released, it wasn't just a tribute to Bon Scott, it was a declaration of survival. An increase in melancholy was turned into an electrical funeral, with the man's most amazing part, the person behind those timeless chords, erupting with energy rather than crying. All of that suffering was buried in every note. Only 25 years old when Angus Young was born, Back in Black rose to fame by a picture of an adult man in a school, which is almost absurd, rather than through virtuosity or captivating speeches to the audience. In uniform, he was head-banging. In the early days of AC/DC, Sister Margaret Young Angus experimented with a variety of outrageous theatrical outfits, including superhero costumes. None of them survived, not even a gorilla or a nurse. Few people know that the clothing wasn't the product of any image consultant or marketing group. "Why don't you just wear a school uniform, Hookie?" Margaret observed the night before. "You always appear to be playing like a child." "Stage outfit?" Angus put it on, and he hasn't removed it since what began as a family joke turned into his. It contained military armor and a man whose before each show, hands shook. Had such terrible stage fright that he had to deceive himself by pretending to be someone otherwise. "When I wear that attire, I'm a character, longer Angus, and that the character is sufficiently insane to perform on stage." For almost half a century, Angus has remained unchanged. His attire: he doesn't adhere to fashion trends, does not update his picture, he does not require smoke machines for enormous stages or just that, choreographed performances. The cherry red SG legs kicked in their outfit. Strong riff and high voltage enough to collapse the entire venue. Since Angus Young believes that repetition isn't dull, it's devotion to oneself, to one's band, as well as the unadulterated rock and roll, he decided to accompany them until the very end in a universe in which musicians swap over their guitars, such as attire, a fresh style during each trip. Check out all of Angus Young's videos. The Gibson SG was the only one I've ever had. Paint without any extra effects or limitations version only has a slender, cherry red frame that appears fused to him each time he takes a stride. I don't need 20 guitars on stage, Angus. I only require the one that knows what I'm saying. SG isn't just, it is a faithful interpreter and an instrument. Between the world and his hands when Angus shudders before a guitar performance. Grounds him when words can't adequately convey it, sings for him when he feels. When Bon Scott departed the band, Malcolm did too. Perished when the cries of millions of admirers below, and he just experienced loneliness. That guitar was still there under the lights. Additionally, in contrast to many other guitarists, never once did Angus attempt to play faster, shred harder, or flaunt himself with elaborate tricks. He doesn't solo for attention, but rather to lock his inner scream. He steadied himself into a material object that he can. For Angus, the Gibson SG is similar to an unflashy, unchanging claws of wild animals, but sufficiently acute to cut through time, familiar enough to get him through all storms, and sincere enough to require an answer that nobody would anticipate. That a guy who sprints like a tornado on for two, the stage head bang like crazy. A person who works straight hours is trembling each time he performs, but Angus is exactly that. Young has been there since the beginning. When AC/DC took the stage, Angus was aware he wasn't meant to be in the spotlight. Dislikes speaking in front of large groups of people. He finds it difficult to handle the media. He once acknowledged, "I'm not adept in striking a balance between my own world." Consequently, prior to each performance he enters a recognizable state. Anxiety that is breathless, icy hands, and a stomach knotted up as if he were about to make a mistake that cannot be undone by those around him. Glimpse of flaming Angus at the ideal moment. Young, but he's fighting on the inside to remain upright. Prior to the start of the show, he managed to get through by turning into another person every time he dons the in his school outfit. Angus changes. The man's fear of the stage has subsided. Turns into the persona he developed, a defiant, crazy misfit schoolchild. It's that daring, fearless personality. Not Angus, who roars and darts on stage, alternating between the cherry red SG playing every riff as though it were a shout. Angus looked directly into the face of terror. Does not smoke, drink, or rely on using sedatives to cope with his panic. One custom is to put on the attire, tune the instrument. He lowers his head, and most of the time, I want to run because I'm so afraid. Away, but I've figured out how to hold on to it within and convert it into power. When the first drum hits, I'm not the same person. Fear is a constant, but rather than Angus lives with it while fleeing from it, performs with it, and above all never allows it to prevail, which is what makes Angus Young is unique. He can't stand, he stands there to get worked on stage. Since it is the only location where fear turns into music, and perhaps those everyone believes that frantic headbangs are Angus are actually the only members of the act. Retaining himself, Angus Young has never been fond of describing himself, particularly to those they go to music just to discover not only something to critique, but also less to those who claim that AC/DC planted messages that are violent, evil, or satanic. The Thoughts of Youth in the Late Highway to Hell was released in the 1970s. Suddenly, AC/DC was the focus of the movement known as Satanic Panic. Criticized rock music as a tool of the devil. They were charged with disseminating malicious messages, and there were even reports that if you listened to their records in reverse, you'd discover satanic messages concealed in the. Angus responds with a wry laugh as the music plays. He said it backwards to hear a message. During one of his infrequent public statements, "Why annoyance? it stated directly on the cover. If I were clear, it would be Highway to Hell. I would need to sketch you a map. Angus Young blunts iconic cool sarcasm and never making an effort to win over anyone. There is no moral discourse in rock and roll. It is a natural rebellion of life power. That everyone is entitled to use no authorization is required, and similarly to how he plays the same game and dons the same uniform. Playing a guitar and shaking his head. Additionally been penning the identical lyrics for years of drinking, women, darkness, and insurrection without adornment or justifications avoidance, not because he's exalting anything negative, but he believes music is the only medium through which individuals can be truthful about their less desirable aspects. Without needing to express regret, Angus Young's communication skills have never been strong. Concerning feelings, yet if there's one thing had caused him to slip into an exceptionally long pause, that was his death. Malcolm Young, his brother, wasn't being AC/DC's co-founder. He influenced the full tone, cadence, and vibe of Angus was the lightning for the band. Malcolm was the solid on stage. A man who never played on the earth underneath it, an out-of-time riff, a man who always understood when to stop talking, and, above all, a man Angus could ever really trust because they collaborated on music in their living room in Sydney. They didn't need a lot of words, they conversed with one another. Using guitars, Malcolm was given a severe dementia diagnosis. He forgot he has composed the chords for the tunes that recognized that Angus had elevated AC/DC to the pinnacle. Was unchangeable, but he nevertheless took Malcolm leaving the studio and entering the yard, took a seat beside him and played the guitar for on several days. Malcolm didn't reply. On some days he simply nodded. Malcolm Young, just 3 years later, died as usual. Angus didn't provide a lengthy address, he merely stated, "Mal was the AC/DC Foundation. Without Mal I wouldn't have taken any action." However, that every power-up note was filled with loss. After years, the album was released in 2020. Of AC/DC being Angus referred to it as an album for Malcolm was once like Back in Black. Said goodbye to Bon Scott, and all the way through the recording procedure an empty guitar was stored by Angus and Malcolm has no place in the studio. No one was sitting there anymore to touch it. Angus Malcolm was more than just a sibling. Was the sole one on the planet who could ensure he arrives on stage on time and in life. Following the numerous occasions he bled for his music, Angus Young picked a peaceful spot to reside somewhere other than Los Angeles, London, or a multi-million-dollar home on the beach or an extravagant rock star home, but a modest Netherlands home where he and Ellen, his wife, has led a tranquil life. Having spent more than 40 years together, they have no kids, and they've never given an explanation. Why does Angus never appear at entertainment activities without film festivals, no fashion displays, no weddings with coworkers or medal ceremonies? He hardly vanishes. Totally isolated from the outside world when he's not performing on tour, as though he was never really a member of the public. Simply stopping by to perform, then taking a step back. He doesn't use social media accounts, rarely conduct interviews unless vitally important, doesn't use selfies, are not taken by smartphones. Provide weekly band updates, such as many contemporary artists, only require a peaceful area to place his guitar. Woman by his side who is aware of his well-being, a nice cup of tea, a tiny garden, and nobody asking too many questions. Someone once inquired, "Are you content without having kids?" "I have Ellen, Malcolm, the band, and the music, but I don't think I'm Angus Young because I'm quiet and lacking something." Angus simply shrugged. Is the reward after a retreat, not the retreat itself. Screaming for rock and roll all your life. In 2023, a Sydney real estate company demolished an old, rundown house in Burwood, a normal suburb with no special fences or signage. In Australian currency, it was just $5.8 million. They were unaware that this was the childhood house of Angus and George Malcolm, the place where the first riffs sounded, and that it was a money property that needed to be approved for renovations. From the living room a legend arises. The hopes of Scottish immigrant boys and flickering amplifiers were used to envision that house, which had been a part of the family's past. Imagine this as you stand in front of it. It was once a destination of pilgrimage for fans who traveled from all over the world. It had a memorial plaque, Australian rock and roll's birthplace, but due to a string of administrative errors, the property's historical significance was never transferred to the new owner. Proprietors, and so the morning of June came. When the news broke, Australia was shocked and incredulous. Thousands of AC/DC fans registered their opinions. Historians, artists, and protesting journalists all expressed their outrage, yet Angus Young said nothing. Remained silent as usual. Perhaps he thought that house had long since passed. However, the sound of his guitar was inaudible to everyone who grew up with it. Landmark in their memories and its destruction, even if it is unintentional. It's as if the essence of rock and roll had been found and shattered in the middle of a heartless city. Legacy doesn't always go away in a loud explosion, it goes away quietly. Perhaps the only person who truly hears it is Angus Young. Angus's career path began when Malcolm Young asked him in 1973, when he was 18 years old, to form a group called the Alternate Current, abbreviation C/DC. They didn't realize they were embarking on one of the wildest, longest, and most uncompromising journeys in rock and roll. Naturally, he just took a few things and had no formal instructions or strategy. Wore a Gibson SG and a schoolboy's suit. Body that is attached to a high-voltage line, and an intensity that even he could not explain. While other artists were trying to figure out their style at the time, Angus didn't make any choices. Simply stayed true to himself, and something in nature became a metaphor. AC/DC was once a legitimate bar band. There were bottles flying in the commotion as people shouted and played in the middle of drinking. When High Voltage, released by AC/DC in 1975, and Let There Is Rock, Angus developed his famous stage style, which consists of a continuous frantic duck walk, knee-hopping, and head-banging to every riff like a controlled sound seizure. In 1977, Angus was a livewire. Theatrical presence, yet concealed underneath the madness was a very well-structured mind. Each riff structure was under his and Malcolm's supervision. Angus was more than his stage persona in every rhythm and melodic progression. Was the cornerstone of the music. When Bon Scott died in 1980, it seemed like everything was about to fall apart, but at that moment, Angus went beyond being the band's energetic younger brother, and became their main source of inspiration. Malcolm co-wrote the book Back in Black Not. The theme from Back in Black's beginning was never completely replicated in a musical farewell to Bon Peak, but it has a lasting memory. It echoes at stadiums, festivals, and weddings. Movies, altercations, funerals, and the man the author was just 25. The musical styles of Angus changed continuously throughout the 1980s and 2000s. Young kept on wearing the same attire. The album Breaker Stiff Upper Lip Power Up, which was released for those who are going to rock the edge ball of Razor even in 2020, features Malcolm delivering riffs while playing the same guitar that looked antiquated yet continuously gave the updated AC/DC Goosebumps generation goosebumps. It was the oldest brother who died of dementia. Angus didn't modify to stay up to date for the entire tour, even though AC/DC experienced lineup changes, controversies, significant dismissals, and massive returns. Angus Young is a living example of aging, that you don't have to become someone else. Otherwise, you simply have to be Angus Young. This isn't done to appease the public or hide anything. In an attempt to become a legend, he simply played one item in the same way. wearing the same clothes and voicing the same inner cries for half a century, as the world changed as technology improved. Even his own band changed, but Angus remained true to the natural rhythm and never sped up, never strayed, and never lost it. He never spoke of loneliness, but you saw it in the way he bowed. At every performance, take a position in front of the amplifier. He never cried on stage, but you could hear that agony in the thumping opening. He never composed a riff for Thunderstruck. There was never a desire for large, dazzling announcements. Awards never told his life narrative on talk demonstrates, but he stayed there even though AC/DC nearly failed because of the friendship funerals at every point. The world thought he couldn't go on, so he went back to the street wearing the same old uniform that he was accustomed with, SG. All it takes is one word. There is no rock and roll star like Angus Young. He is the flame's bearer and the unending current.